Good morning. We are on day 51 and we are looking at the Gospel of Luke today. This, of course, is just volume 1 of 2 in Luke's writings, because it forms the first half of the Luke Acts pair, which for some reason that I've never succeeded in understanding, is separated by the Gospel of John in the canonical order in the Bible. But nonetheless, Luke and Acts form two halves of a pair. And today we're going to look at Luke. So who is our author? The questions we've been asking of the Gospels all along. And once again, it is not, there's no kind of sign off at the beginning or the end that tells us for certain who the author is. But early tradition, the very early church, believed this to be the work of Dr. Luke. So Luke was a Gentile Christian, almost certainly Gentile Christian, who travelled with Paul, and we'll talk about him again when we get to Acts, because we get a sense that Luke is describing his own part in the story as well, in a kind of low-key sort of way. So Luke travels with Paul. He's described as being a doctor in Colossians 4:14, and his particular interest as a Gentile Christian comes through in this gospel. He has an interest in the universal scope of the gospel, that it is not only for Jews but also for Greeks. Actually, his idea in his interest in the universal scope goes beyond the Jew-Gentile divide. It's not only for men but also for women, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. Not only for the rich but also for the poor. Even some of the language that he uses reflects, I think, the fact that he was a doctor. So he tends to give us slightly more technical medical terminology. I mean, not in comparison with, reading the New England Journal of Medicine today, but nonetheless, he sounds as if he's quite interested in diseases. I used to be I am a doctor, I should say, because I've just re-registered with the GMC, in case I'm needed. You can never ever sort of become a layperson again once you're medically trained, I think, in the sense that I always want to know. I want to know what's wrong with people. I want to understand what's going on, and I get really frustrated when things are filtered through lay people's terminology and so on, because I can't work it out. And I think Luke's a bit like that, and I think you get a sense of that sometimes when you read his accounts of people's illnesses. But his language, more importantly, his language to describe Jesus, I think, is reflective of the fact that he's got a medical training. So he describes Jesus as, the Greek word is sotor, which is usually translated saviour, and I think correctly translated saviour. But this word of sotor encompasses not only salvation in terms of what you might hope for when an army turns up at the last minute, when you're kind of, losing a battle, or what you might hope for when the Messiah comes. But it also describes a healer, because a doctor would be described in these terms as well. And this language of saving overlaps with the language of healing. So we shouldn't, obviously, I'm not suggesting we should collapse down our understanding of what Luke is saying about Jesus to he's just saying he's a great healer. He's not at all, and we see that very clearly. But nonetheless, to Luke, Jesus is a healer, and I think there is something about the way he worships Jesus that is particularly medical, if you know what I mean. If it particularly comes from this background. Anyway, enough of that fanciful stuff. Let's talk a little bit more about dating, which I guess is also a bit fanciful, to be honest, because as always we don't know the date for sure. It's probably written in about the early 60s, in the 1st century. He couldn't have written this book much sooner than that, because because Acts, which is the sequel, contains an account of Paul's imprisonment in Rome, so it can't have been completed until that had taken place, and that's at the beginning of the 60s. If he'd written it much later, then it would have borne some trace, probably, of the persecution under Nero. Or certainly it would have borne some trace of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. So he slightly pays your money, he takes your choice, but probably sometime in the early 60s is the best guess. And if you're really thinking hard, and I don't anticipate that anyone will have done the maths here, but then that slightly contradicts what I said about Mark a couple of days ago, because I did suggest that Mark was the earliest gospel, and I also suggested that Mark was written possibly during Nero's persecution, and that kind of doesn't add up with what I've just said about Luke perhaps predating that. So as you can tell, there's a certain amount of unclearness and ambiguity, and it depends which commentator you read and so on. But these documents are written early. They are written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses to the events that they're talking about, and that is very important. In fact, Luke emphasizes that he has used eyewitnesses. Luke himself, there's no suggestion Luke himself was an eyewitness, but he has taken time to consult eyewitnesses. Let me just read you the first 4 verses of his letter, of his gospel here. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of these things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Now, we don't really know for sure well, we don't know at all who this Theophilus guy was. It's likely that he was a Gentile convert who wanted to know a bit more about this Jesus he'd put his faith in. That's probably the most likely explanation. Some people have said, because Theophilus means lover of God, so it could be a kind of code name or a nickname for somebody. It might not be their actual given name. It could even be a kind of nickname for the whole Christian community or the Gentile believers or something. Maybe it's not referring to an individual, but a group of people, a church or something. So we're not quite clear for whom it is written, but we do get a sense of why it is written. So Luke says, well, we've got eyewitness accounts, and I wanted to put things into order, to order them, in order that you, whoever the you is, in order that you may have certainty considering the things you have been taught. Now let's talk about the eyewitnesses first. So if Luke is accompanying Paul, as he appears to have done, and we're going to talk about Paul's journeys when we get to Acts in a few days' time. But Paul spends about 2 years in prison in Jerusalem. And Luke appears to have been accompanying him up to that point. Now that seems likely then that Luke would have had some time on his hands when he was in Jerusalem. And I can't prove this to you, but it seems likely that Luke used that time to track down eyewitnesses and to find out, to get the evidence which he is going to lay out in this orderly account that he gives us. And one of those eyewitnesses, it seems quite likely, would have been Mary, the mother of Jesus, because we do hear her perspective a number of times in this gospel. And it seems likely then that she was one of the witnesses that Luke consults in preparation for writing this. Now, whoever this Theophilus is, they appear to have had some questions, or at least in Luke's mind, there are some things that they might want to know. And the sorts of questions that Luke is addressing in his gospel are things like, how did this movement, which began within Judaism, become the basis of an offer of salvation for the whole world? Do Gentiles really belong here? If Jesus was originally the Messiah for Israel, what relevance is that for Gentiles who are not seeking a Messiah? And why was it that he was then confronted with such opposition within Israel that they crucified him? And then a follow-on question from that would be, how can a crucified Messiah become the basis of hope for the whole of humanity? How can a figure who is slain be the centre of God's hope? And one of the ways we could describe Luke's theme is about God's plan, about God having a plan to save the world. And so a natural question that Luke might be wanting to answer is, why should anybody respond to Jesus or consider Jesus to be the centre of God's plan? and what is it that Jesus is calling his followers to do? So you can imagine, I think, that those would be the sorts of questions that a Gentile convert might have. And we need to remember, and I'm sure in theory we remember this, but actually we need to kind of think our way backwards into the worldview a bit, because, you know, Theophilus, whoever he was, and Luke's original readers didn't have the Bible. They didn't have the New Testament, I mean, obviously, but actually think about that and think about how much we know from perhaps repeated readings of the New Testament, how much has kind of become part of our understanding of Jesus, kind of got under our skin and become, you know, the patterns of thought that we think when we think about Jesus and we think about God and so on. But the first readers, of course, didn't have all of that. This is being laid down. And so here we are seeing Luke kind of setting these important foundations for the theology of the early church, really. So what does Luke give us that the other Gospels don't? I spoke a couple of days ago about how the Gospels were written, we think, and how it's likely that Luke would have sat down with a copy of Mark's Gospel, possibly with this other source that we've never seen but we think existed, which we kind of named Q. And then his other research, which I've already referred to. So from these, sounds like he had this three different documents, if you like. He's got his jottings from his interviews he's conducted. He's got Mark's Gospel, and he's got this this notional document called Q. And so then he compiles his Gospel with his own particular agenda and interests to try and communicate those things. And then he has some particular things that the other Gospels don't have. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a complete list, but let me try and give you an indicator of some of the things that Luke brings that if we didn't have Luke's Gospel, we wouldn't know about. So in Luke 5, we read about a miraculous catch of fish and the call of Peter. The other synoptic Gospels don't have that one, I think. We get the raising to life of the son of the woman from Nain in chapter 7, which is unique to Luke, I think. We get the casting out of a demon from a deaf man in chapter 11, the healing of a woman with a bent back in chapter 13, the healing of a man with dropsy in chapter 14, the healing of the 10 lepers. Do you remember the one where only one of them bothers to come back and say thank you? Beloved of Sunday school teachers and parents everywhere, that one. That's unique to Luke, I think. And the healing of the ear of the high priest's servant is also, I think, unique to Luke. And we also have some parables that only Luke gives us. We have the Good Samaritan, the friend at midnight who comes and knocks and won't stop knocking until he gets his request responded to. The rich fool, I'm going to speak about that a bit more tomorrow. The shepherd who abandons the 99, well, temporarily abandons the 99 to go and seek the one, and the woman with the 10 coins, and the father with the 2 sons. That beautiful sort of triptych of parables in chapter 15. The parable of the unrighteous agent, which is quite a puzzling one. You know, the one who kind of gets the debts reduced in order to curry favour with his master's debtors. I'm developing a theory about that one, but it's a bit too soon to make it public. Check back in with me in a year or two and I'll tell you if I think it's worth saying. There's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. That's not the healing of the resurrection of Lazarus. This is the parable of a poor man called Lazarus who lies at the gate of a rich man who ignores him. Parable of the widow and the unrighteous just in chapter 18, and the Pharisee and the tax collector in chapter 18. One of the possibilities that I have seen offered is that all of this special Lucan material may derive from eyewitnesses among the circle of women who surrounded Jesus, and Luke is particularly interested in women. So let me show you this circle of women who surrounded Jesus first. I just love these beautiful 2 or 3 verses. In fact, we named one of our daughters after one of these women. Hang on, let me just turn the page. So chapter 8, verse 1. Soon afterwards, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him. Of course, that's the 12 male disciples. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Incidentally, there was nothing in any of the Gospels that suggests that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. So Mary, called Magdalene, and Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others. And then listen to this. This is the stunning bit. Who provided for them out of their means. These women of, at least some of them, of independent income, are supporting Jesus's ministry financially. And I'm just blown away by that when I think about it, because it's quite countercultural for the day. And I even wonder, and I'm not sure about this, but I even wonder if it would have raised some eyebrows in terms of it seem as rather improper. I don't know for sure about that, but I have my suspicions. But certainly countercultural that these women would be financially supporting Jesus. Now, if I just skim back over briefly that list I gave you a moment ago of the things that Luke brings in particular, we have quite a lot of feminine interests in that. The widow of Nain, whose son is raised, the woman with the bent back, the woman who loses her coin, the widow who won't leave the unrighteous judge alone. So quite a lot of sort of female stories and female imagery there, which would lend credence to that suggestion that quite a lot of this material may have come from that circle of women. Now, as I've hinted a couple of times, women are of interest to Luke, and he tends to tell pairs of stories. And when he tells a pair of stories, he very often has a kind of matching story about a man and a woman. And when that is the case, sometimes the woman is being shown in a better light than the man. So let me show you some of these examples. We begin with Zacchaeus and Mary. So an angel visits both of them to say that there's going to be a miraculous birth. Zacchaeus, of course, is going to be the father of John the Baptist, and obviously Mary, the mother of Jesus. Zacchaeus doesn't believe, and Mary does, but there's your pairing. Then, just after Jesus has been born, they go to the temple, and we get the pairing of Simeon and Anna, both of them old people who hang about in the temple hoping to see God's deliverer, and they both rejoice when they meet the infant Jesus. In Luke 4, when Jesus' healings start, he heals a man with an unclean spirit, and then he heals Simon's mother-in-law. In chapter 7, he heals the servant of the centurion and the son of the widow. In chapter 7 also, we get a story where a sinful woman, in inverted commas, anoints Jesus' feet. And he's at a banquet with a kind of very self-righteous religious leader, male religious leader. And Jesus points to the woman, as it were, and lifts her up as an example in order to criticise this man. Also, I haven't written down the chapter of this one, but we get the paired story or paired reference to Naaman and the widow of Zarephath. These are two stories from the Elijah-Elisha part of Kings. And Jesus couples these to talk about how the gospel is going to reach beyond Judaism. And again, a man and a woman. In Luke 10, we get the very well-known story of Mary and Martha, two women, of course, but Martha is occupying the traditionally female role, and Mary is doing what traditionally a man would have done and sitting at Jesus' feet to listen to his teaching. And she's commended as a woman for or maybe commended, although a woman, as it were, for occupying this traditionally male role. In Luke 13, interestingly, a story where a woman with a disabling spirit is healed, and she praises God, and the male synagogue ruler is indignant about what has happened. And Jesus then calls him a hypocrite and reminds him of the woman's status as a daughter of Abraham. A lovely moment. In Luke 15, we get this little triptych of stories I've referred to already. The lost sheep, which is about a male shepherd. The lost coin, which is about a female, about a woman who has lost her dowry coin. And then, of course, the story of the prodigal son. In Luke 18, 2 little parables about prayer. One is a male one, the Pharisee and the tax collector, and one is a female one, the persistent widow. And then in Luke 23, Jesus stops on his way to the cross to address female mourners. And in Luke 24, women are the first witnesses of the resurrection. And women as witnesses in those days were their testimony was regarded as suspect, and twice as many women were required to testify as men in order to carry the same weight in court. And yet, when this most important moment in history takes place, you would have imagined that God would have set it up so that it was really reliable witnesses who were the first to see, so that they could testify and be believed. But it's not, it's women who first see it. I'm going to close out today by just reading you a little excerpt from Dorothy Sayers, who you may know of her if you know the Lord Peter Wimsey detective stories. She wrote those. But she was also a passionate disciple of Jesus Christ, and she wrote these words, which she doesn't derive this entirely from Luke, but I think Luke would have been a major source for these words. Perhaps it is no wonder that women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged them, never flattered or coaxed or patronised, who never made sick jokes about women, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took women's questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out a certain sphere for women, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took women as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. There is no act, no sermon, no parable in the whole gospel that borrows its point or pungency from female perversity. Nobody could get from the words and deeds of Jesus that there was anything funny or inferior about women. I think that's stunning and beautiful. Actually makes me a little bit emotional. Jesus was the perfect non-toxic man, and I think Luke shows us that. Tomorrow I'm going to pick up on some more themes from Luke. See you then.